Good evening. How is everyone? Good. I'm glad to see all of you again. I'm Klaus Laues. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm very pleased to tell you again that it's really nice and sunny outside. So thank you very much for coming. As you know, I've been organizing the Krasno event series since 2012. So for 7 years, and we have had almost 100 speakers I counted recently. And of course today we have another two impressive and leading scholars who will talk to us. Let me just point out to you that we still have a mailing list. If you're not yet on my mailing list, there's a sheet of paper circulating. Please put your name and your email address on it, and I will then transfer it to our electronic mailing list. We also have a website, which you see on the screen, krasnoevents.com, and we have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Krasno-UNC. So if you miss our session today, or if you can't get enough and would like to see it again, maybe even several times, our YouTube channel is ideal. And of course, you can follow back all the events we have organized since 2012. And they are all worth watching, I can assure you. So please don't forget about our YouTube channel. We have a new team of helpers, some who have remained, but some students have graduated, and we have taken on a few others. There is still Will, who is behind the camera, who does, of course, a very important job. Then we have a new senior assistant, that's Rebecca Mizell at the back. Then there's Mary Newby, there's Sarah Shapiro and Valerie, and also Cole Ventura, who is somewhere in the room. There he is, and he was a helpful guy who went to the parking lot to make sure that people know how to put the 4 quarters into the meters. You know, there's also a parking app, but also the old-fashioned way seems to work. Today, we have an event on Germany. More about that in a little while. But we have our next event already this coming Tuesday, and that is a New York Times correspondent, that is a bureau chief in Beijing, Jane Perles. She has been with the New York Times for many years. She earned a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on Somalia. She has also reported on Indonesia for the New York Times. And for the last 7 or 8 years, she has been bureau chief in Beijing. And she will talk to us about her time in Beijing. And her talk is entitled "Tales from a New York Times Correspondent from Beijing." So that's coming Tuesday already, here in this room at 5:30 p.m. Today we have 2 great speakers, that is Hope Harrison and Joshua Rubenstein. Hope and I go back a long time. I think we first met when we were both PhD students some 200 years ago now, something like that. And Hope is a very distinguished scholar. She is still working on Germany a lot. She is working on Europe. She's working sometimes on Russia and the United States, or a combination of all these topics, both during the Cold War era and the post-Cold War era. She was the director of the Elliott School's Institute for Europe, Russian and Eurasian Affairs. She also used to be an associate dean for research at the Elliott School, and she even worked on the National Security Council at the White House for a little while. She has written a very well-known book entitled "Driving the Soviets Up the Wall," and somehow I think Hope likes walls, or she likes to write about walls, because her new book is called "After the Berlin Wall: Memory and the New Germany from 1989 to the Present," and that book will be published in the next couple of months, and I'm sure a couple of weeks, thank you. And I'm sure it will be very popular, because there is, of course, a 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall, and people will just flock to the bookshops and buy it. And just in case you may forget about the title of the book, we have a helpful flyer lying at the back of the room, so you can take that flyer back home and remember which book you always wanted to read. And then our second speaker today, who will actually start the proceedings, because we start chronologically, that is Joshua Rubenstein. And Joshua is associated with the David Center for Russian Affairs at Harvard University. Joshua worked for 37 years for Amnesty International. He was the Northeast Regional Director. But he also is, as I just said, associated with the Davis Center at Harvard, and he is Associate Director for Major Gifts at the Harvard Law School. So he's a man of many talents, and particularly that last talent, getting us major gifts, is, I think, very useful. So I would like you to ask you to come back as often as possible and bring major gifts to the Krasner series, please. Joshua has also been a prolific author. I have no idea how he found the time to do that. He has written 10 books already, and they have all been translated in a lot of different languages. And his latest book is called The Death of Stalin in the year 1953. And what I should have done is I should have shown you these flyers when I first introduced Hope. And here, that is the flyer for Joshua's book. It is a great pleasure to have Hope Harrison and Joshua Rubenstein here. The way we will proceed today is that Joshua will first talk to us about Stalin's death and the tragedy and failure that had for the German question and the Cold War more generally. And then we turn to Hope Harrison talking about present-day Germany. And after that, we will again have a little panel discussion on stage once the screen has gone up. And after that, we will have a very exciting discussion with you. And as always, I expect you to ask many, many engaged questions. Thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers. And our first speaker is Joshua Rubenstein.
Thank you. I want to particularly thank Professor Klaus Lars for inviting me. And I also want to acknowledge how his work helped inform my work and my research and my thinking when I was writing about the last days of Stalin. Just to remind you that Stalin collapsed on March 1st, 1953, a Sunday, and died on March 5th, 1953, just a few days later. But the context is very important for this story. The war ended in the spring of 1945 with the four major powers occupying Berlin and Germany. And there were four separate zones set up for the British, the Americans, the French, and of course, for the Soviets. And for a while, they cooperated with each other about how to administer Germany, which was not just defeated, but devastated. But the first major crisis turned out to be a major miscalculation on Stalin's part. Many of us think back to the Cold War and the first years of the Cold War as being driven by a very smart, very calculating Machiavellian Stalin. But in fact, he made many mistakes. And the Berlin blockade was one of them. Stalin's intention was always to figure out a way first to drive out the Western powers from Berlin and ultimately figure out a way to keep Germany united, even if that meant demilitarizing Germany and having all the troops leave, but perhaps leaving Soviet troops on the border to quote-unquote guarantee the peace. He knew that a West Germany, and there was no West Germany officially yet, the Federal Republic of Germany, would always be stronger and larger. The population of the three Western zones was about 50 million people. The population of the Soviet zone was 18 million. But in the middle of the Soviet-dominated zone was Berlin. And Berlin itself was divided into four zones: the French, the Americans, the British, and the Soviet zone. And they controlled the city, administered the city together. But by 1948, Stalin saw the need to exert greater pressure on the Western zone, particularly the Americans. So gradually he established a blockade of land, the canal, and railroad to prevent freight and goods being brought into West Berlin. The hope was that the Berliners, the West Berliners, would become so unhappy, find life so difficult without adequate food and heat in the winter months, that they would want to have the city united with East Berlin, and the West would simply withdraw. And Western officials, particularly in Washington, entertained the idea of actually abandoning West Berlin to the Soviets. They weren't sure how to proceed. Keep in mind, Truman was president and faced re-election that fall, in the fall of 1948. But rather than accede to Soviet demands, Western military officials, the American officials in Berlin and in Washington, decided to organize a blockade, to organize an airlift to thwart the blockade. And this turned out to be a magnificent success. They brought in hundreds of millions of tons of food and other supplies into West Berlin. Children were greeting the flights as they came in. The flights would sometimes drop toys and candy to the children. And this cemented the feeling of loyalty among West Berliners to the West. First, they were not being abandoned. Secondly, they understood the prowess and the might of the Western alliance, particularly the Americans. And it completely turned them off, became even more disillusioned to Stalin and this very malicious attempt to thwart the West control of West Berlin. Now, Stalin did not put aside his idea of creating a unified Germany that would thwart the creation of a Western alliance with Western Germany. But keep in mind, NATO was established in April of 1949 in the final weeks of the airlift. West Germany joined NATO in 1955. But this already meant that a strong and going ever stronger West Germany would become part of the Western military alliance. And that was very much against Stalin's wishes. This came to a head in 52 and 53. By 1952, the East German Communist Party began instituting more harsh measures on East Germany. Keep in mind, both West Germany and East Germany were officially established in 1949. The Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic were their official names. And this so frightened and destabilized East German society that between January and April of 1953, and Stalin dies in March, 120,000 refugees freely moved from East Berlin into West Berlin. There were no border controls. At the same time, in November of 1952, General David Eisenhower is elected president. Now, Eisenhower was the first Republican president in 20 years, after Roosevelt and Truman. The most recent Republican president had been Herbert Hoover, who left office in 1933. And Eisenhower, helped by Foster Dulles, campaigned on a policy not only of containing communism. No, they thought they could roll back communism, that they would have an ambitious, very hostile policy to turn back the tide against communism. And this, of course, was a direct rebuke of George Kennan, the famous American diplomat, who had devised the policy of containment. So Eisenhower comes into office in January of 1953. Winston Churchill is again, to everyone's surprise, the Prime Minister of England. He's older, he's a bit infirm, but he has not lost his sense of history. And Churchill is encouraging Eisenhower to meet with Stalin. They had met in 1945 when Eisenhower had visited Moscow. And Churchill saw that this was a possible opportunity to reduce the tensions of the Cold War. No one could be sure what could come of it, but keep in mind the Americans had already had the atomic bomb. The Soviets were working on their own and exploded it, and were working on their own hydrogen bomb. But Eisenhower resisted this appeal from Churchill. And then out of the blue, Stalin collapsed on March 1st. So let's just tell a bit of that story. Stalin died on March 5th, a few days after suffering a terrible stroke on Sunday, March 1st. Pravda carried this front page article on March 6th. You'll notice that Stalin has his hand in his blouse as if he's Napoleon-like, very commanding. He doesn't look like a man who's 74. Officially, he was 73, but in his early 20s, he decided to change his birth date and make himself a year younger. No one knows exactly why. The photograph is very much touched up. His hair had grown considerably thinner and was gray. His face had become much more sallow, as had his mustache. What I also want to point out is that under the portrait of Stalin, you see the medical bulletin. The medical bulletin was signed by 11 prestigious doctors in Moscow, none of whom could be Jewish. The reason for that was just months before, the doctors' plot had been announced. An alleged conspiracy led by Jewish doctors who were said to maliciously use their medical care, their medical knowledge, to undermine the health of Soviet leaders. And this unleashed an anti-Semitic campaign in the Soviet press. So the new leadership had to assure the population first that Stalin had died a natural death and that he had received proper medical treatment. In fact, his stroke was so severe that nothing could have helped him, even the intervention of Western medicine at that time. Now, this is my favorite photograph from that era. A restaurant in Washington offered free borscht to all its customers. This is on March 6th, the next day. I'm sure it's a Jewish deli. What else could it be? Now, this is a very interesting photograph. This is March 7th, 2 days after Stalin died, the first time to show him in repose. Now, I want to assure you that Stalin was not the size of King Kong. He was actually 5'6". But they photoshopped the photograph so that Stalin looks like Gulliver and his heirs look like the Lilliputians. I also want to point out that far to the left in the back row is Khrushchev. And first next to Stalin is Malenkov, then Beria. So Malenkov is primus inter pares, first among equals. Whoever's standing or nearest to Stalin's head, his corpse, is the first among equals. But they were projecting an image of collective leadership that no one would assume personal power after Stalin's death. Now, this photo appears a day later. There are two things to point out. First, Khrushchev has moved up in the hierarchy. You see him on the right. He's now third on the right, away from us. Malenkov remains closest to Stalin's head, and the image of Stalin still dominates the photograph. They are still obedient to him, and they rule in his shadow, even though he's now passed away. Now, for 3 days, Stalin's body lay in state in the Hall of Columns in the House of Unions, the most prestigious public hall in Moscow, where Lenin's funeral had also taken place in January of 1924. We believe that hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets of Moscow. Many were killed in the crush, were trampled to death, not because the regime acted with malicious intent, but because it simply lost control of the crowds. Khrushchev admitted later that well over 100 people died, but no one can say for sure how many. This is a picture in front of the Bolshoi Theater in central Moscow. The Hall of Unions is to our left, just a block or two away. And you see it's March, it's winter, it's very cold. And these are how people are lined up. Now, this photograph shows the leaders of the Soviet Union following the casket. It was led from the Hall of Unions to Red Square. And you see the photos of people I think are familiar to us. There's Khrushchev. Mikoyan in the back. Mikoyan, 10 years later, led the Soviet delegation to Washington after Kennedy's assassination. So he remained close to the levers of power for many years. Here's Beria in that famous hat and pince-nez. Here's Malenkov in the center. Bulganin, Molotov. But who's this gentleman in the middle with the Asian features? That's Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai led a 19-man, it was all men, a 19-man delegation of Chinese communist leaders from Beijing to Moscow. Mao Zedong stayed home. Now, the interesting thing is that Zhou Enlai never stood or walked with other foreign delegates, even with other foreign communist delegates. He always walked or sat or stood among Soviet communist leaders. He was given special treatment during the funeral services. Now, this crowd assembled in Prague on March 9th, 1953, at the very moment that the funeral was taking place in Moscow. In fact, similar crowds gathered in every capital in Eastern Europe. It is said that in Tirana, Albania, Enver Hoxha, the dictator there, assembled the entire adult population of 2.5 million people, made them stand on their knees, sit on their knees, and read for 2.5 hours a document expressing their loyalty to the departed comrade Stalin. The same thing took place in East Germany, where flags and banners and black crepe were decorated every conceivable building, including hot dog stands. What's interesting is that in the days leading up to Stalin's death, in early March, East Berliners would go into West Berlin to get legitimate, credible news on Stalin's death, on Stalin's health. And they also wanted to know when they could break out bottles of champagne that they wanted to swig once they knew that Stalin had died. But they couldn't rely on the news reporting in East Berlin for that, so they went into West Berlin just to get updates on the news. This was in Prague. Now, I share this photo with you for reasons that will become quickly clear. This photo appeared in Pravda the day after Stalin's funeral on March 10th. You have Stalin, you have Mao Zedong, and you have Georgy Malenkov, as if Malenkov is saying, I am now the equal of Stalin and Mao. I am now the natural successor to Stalin. The only problem was that this is the real photograph. In early 1950, the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty was signed. Mao is in Moscow. All the Chinese and Soviet officials are standing there. The only gentleman sitting is Andrei Vyshinsky, who had replaced Vyacheslav Molotov as the foreign minister. And he is signing the document for the Soviets. Here's Malenkov over here, with his hand in his blouse. Here's Stalin. Here's Mao, if I can see it properly. So that's the real photograph. That was in February of 1950 in Pravda. But this is what Malenkov chose to show in 1953. Everyone saw through this. And what was so disturbing is that when Stalin doctored photographs, he was leaving out people he had already killed. He was leaving them out of history, shooting them down Orwell's memory hole. But Malenkov was doing it to his colleagues who were still alive and kicking and were supposed to be sharing power with him. So this was held against Malenkov, and he was demoted in the next few days from at least one major post he had assigned himself. Now, this photograph, we're back in the United States, and the man at the podium is President Eisenhower on April 16th, 1953. And I close with this image in terms of this collection of images because it brings us back to our story of reforms and outreach between West and East. On April 16th in Washington, the Association of Newspaper Editors, Eisenhower delivered one of his two most famous speeches, The Chance for Peace. And in this speech, he purported to reach out to Soviet leaders on the need for negotiations, the need for disarmament, the need to curb the arms race. He pointed out how much it cost to build a jet plane, to build an aircraft carrier, and how that money could be used to develop agriculture, to build hospitals, to build schools. This was his same message for his famous farewell address when he left office in 1960 or perhaps in early 61. Now this generated tremendous goodwill in the West, this speech by Eisenhower. But what took his administration by surprise was that a few days later, the following week, Pravda and the Soviet press reprinted in its entirety, without ridicule, Eisenhower's speech, giving the Soviet public the opportunity to judge for itself what Eisenhower was offering to the Soviet people. And this gesture on the part of the Kremlin, totally confounded Western policymakers and the U.S. Embassy. They'd never heard of such a thing. Eisenhower not only offered his hand to the Soviet leaders, he explicitly blamed Stalin for the division of Europe and for the increase of tensions following World War II. And those remarks were genuinely, honestly, scrupulously translated into Russian and appeared in the Soviet press. So it became obvious to at least some people that the Soviets were looking for dialogue. Dialogue over Korea, dialogue over Germany. And Eisenhower and Foster Dulles rebuffed that opportunity. So what happened between March 5th, 1953, and the famous uprising in Berlin and throughout East Germany in mid-June? Within weeks of Stalin's death, the Soviet government, the new leaders, embarked on a series of both domestic and foreign reforms, and this touched on Germany directly. First, domestically, by the end of March, 1 million prisoners were released from the Soviet Gulag. Not political prisoners, but ordinary criminals. But this reduced the size of the Gulag and reduced the burden on the Soviet budget. They understood this was a wasteful exercise in repression. Secondly, I mentioned the doctor's plot. In early April, they publicly disavowed the doctor's plot, announced the release of those doctors whom we know had survived, and publicly announced that they had been tortured, and blamed leaders of the intelligence units for this episode. Of course, Stalin himself was guilty, but they were not ready to blame Stalin for initiating the doctor's plot. At the same time, they promised the Soviet public that they would improve housing conditions, improve light industry, make more food available. This was an admission that things had not been done properly while Stalin was alive. And with regard to Korea, it was the Soviets who made very clear to the Chinese and the North Koreans that they were ready to resume negotiations that ended in success in July of 1953 with the armistice that still governs the peninsula to this day. This was a Soviet initiative to bring an end to the fighting on the peninsula. This was a direct result of Stalin's death and the realization by his heirs that something had to change very dramatically. Now, with regard to Germany, in the last months of Stalin's life, he had it made it more difficult for Western powers to gain access to Berlin. It wasn't a blockade of sorts, but he made things more difficult, more complicated for people to drive in, for trucks to be delivered, for goods to be delivered on the canals. Very quickly, the new leaders relaxed all of these controls. And they seemed to be willing to have some kind of dialogue over Germany, because after all, NATO had now been established. That was done. But West Germany had not joined NATO yet. So there was still some thought on their part that maybe they can avoid a rearmed West Germany in the middle of Europe joining NATO. But again, there is very little stomach on the Western leaders' part for full-scale negotiations over Germany. At the same time, there was unrest in Eastern Europe, both in Bulgaria and in Czechoslovakia. For the first time we know of, there were people in the streets rioting over conditions in those countries and objecting to the Soviet-imposed type of government, type of dictatorship in those countries. The Soviets understood that this could blow up throughout Eastern Europe, including in Germany. So they summoned the leaders of Germany, of East Germany, of Hungary, and others, for talks in early June that they had to relax their system of repression. They even told the Hungarians that too many people had been arrested, well over 1 million in a country of 9 million. Beria himself rebuked them, which seems pretty ironic to us today. But this could not forestall the tragedy in East Germany. For various reasons having to do with onerous work requirements, East German workers revolted in the mid-June, beginning in East Berlin, but spreading to over 500 cities. And these demonstrations and riots were only put down with the intervention of 25,000 heavily armed Soviet troops. Well over the figures I saw, at one point, there were casualties, of course, among the Germans. 6 were executed summarily. 120 were killed, 200 were seriously wounded, and when the whole thing was over 3,000 people were arrested in a purge of workers and their leaders in East Germany. This has to do not only with the revolt that people took the opportunity to do in the wake of Stalin's death, but this put an end to any possibility of further negotiations at that point in the spring of '53 following Stalin's death. And whatever opportunity there may have been between Eisenhower, Foster Dulles, and the new heirs to Stalin, that was all foreclosed with the violent suppression in East Germany. And of course, we end up having a divided Germany until 1989, 1990 itself. So thank you. I'm sure you'll have some questions for us later, and I want to leave the floor to Hope. Thank you.
I'll start here and then.
Overstay and then take your microphone.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Okay. So, hi. It's nice to see you all. Thank you so much, Klaus, for inviting me, and thanks to the whole staff, to the ones I've met, Rebecca, Sarah, and Will. It's really great to be here on your beautiful campus. I have, I guess you could say, become obsessed with the Berlin Wall. I've now written 2 books about the Berlin Wall. The first book, in fact, picked right up where the last talk ended. The first book looked at what happened between Stalin's death in 1953 and the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. I speak Russian and German, and I spent years in the archives in Moscow and Berlin studying that process, finding out that the Soviets, in fact, resisted for 8 years East German leaders' requests to seal off the border in Berlin and stop the refugee exodus. So contrary to what we in the US sort of grew up thinking during the Cold War, Moscow called all the shots and the Berlin Wall really came especially from Moscow. That was not the case. That's why my book was called Driving the Soviets Up the Wall. The East German leader drove the Soviets up the wall because he kept asking and he kept taking unilateral measures at the border in Berlin to push the Soviets into finally agreeing to seal off the last loophole. The Soviets had closed off the bigger border between East Germany and West Germany in 1952, but it wasn't until 1961 where they closed off the border between East and West Berlin. So that was my first book, and when I was done, I thought, okay, where do I want to be for my next book? Do I want to be in Moscow, where the archives are closing and it's really hard as a historian to get good documents? Or do I want to be in Berlin, where things are nicely organized and lots of great documents and an easy, wonderful place to live? And I decided Berlin would be the focus of my second book on the Berlin Wall. So that's what I'm going to talk to you today. And the book right now, it just was born 2 days ago in Cambridge, England, and it's on a plane right now being sent here. So that's why I don't have the book. But as Klaus was nice enough to make these 20% off flyers, which are outside or in the back of the room. So take one with you, give them to your friends. You know, they'll make nice Christmas or Hanukkah presents. So I have spent a lot of time over the past 30 years in Berlin doing research. And today I'm going to give you a taste of some of my new book, which will hopefully make you want to know more. I'm going to talk about a variety of things, from the building of the wall to the fall of the wall, to plans for what's going to happen on November 9th this year, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall in Berlin. Here in the United States, we have recently become engulfed in discussions about our history, and particularly about slavery, about the Civil War, the Confederacy, as I'm sure you all know very well living here. Germany, for decades, has dealt with difficult parts of its past, namely the Holocaust. But they've also started to come to grips with the more recent past, the past of the Berlin Wall and the East German communist regime. And right now in Germany, there are intense, emotional, divisive debates going on between East and West, between various groups of former East Germans about how to understand the history of the wall, how to understand its legacy, how to understand what happened in 1989. So even though it's been 30 years, this is living, emotional, controversial history, in fact, to this day in Germany. I'm going to talk about three things today. The first is I'm going to give you a sense of how German grappling with the history of the wall connects with German national identity and the big historical narrative about Germany. Second, I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of particular individuals that I call memory activists, people who, one of the things I am so interested in is who gets to decide what history gets told in public places. When you go to a museum, when you go to a memorial and you read some historic plaque, or when you go to Berlin and you see what is now a massive site called the Berlin Wall Memorial, which is 8 blocks long, who decided what history gets told there? So I am going to highlight a West German and a non-German and an East German, all private citizens, for their roles in impacting the political narrative that gets told about the history of the wall in Germany. And I'm going to end with telling you a bit about what's planned this year for the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall. I don't have time to talk about many other aspects of this book. For example, the way that music, and particularly Beethoven, is performed to commemorate the wall. Or the trials of border guards who shot people at the wall. I won't have time to give really in-depth personal portraits of some of the people that have influenced this process of remembering the wall. Another very important aspect of the book that I won't be able to get into looks at the intersection of the process of Germans dealing with the Nazi past and the more recent process of dealing with the East German past. These two processes have been very interconnected, and you can't really understand how Germany's approached the wall and the East German communist regime if you don't know how they've dealt with the Nazi past. And finally, I won't be able to talk about the issue of the global memory of the Berlin Wall as opposed to the German memory and how those two interact, all of which are things that I talk about in the book. Okay, so I'm going to take the microphone and sit down, if you don't mind, for the rest of the talk. And first, give you a sense of what the wall was and where it was. It encircled West Berlin, so that as of August 13th, 1961, a summer weekend, no longer were you allowed to go from East Berlin or East Germany. You can see Berlin, it was 110 miles inside of communist East Germany. So by sealing off the border between East and West, no longer was there free movement for East Germans to get into the democratic capitalist West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was 96 miles long, 27 miles of it went through the center of Berlin. From the end of the war in 1945 until the wall was built in 1961, over 3 million people fled from the east, from the Soviet zone in the east, to the west. In the 28 years the wall was up, from 1961 to 1989, at least 140 people were killed at the wall. Hundreds more were killed along the border between East Germany and West Germany, or up at the Baltic Sea, for a total of around 400 to 500. They're still actually doing research to figure out exactly how many people were killed. The wall began, as you can see, first with barbed wire and then with these concrete bricks. When the West didn't do anything to take it down, they were very relieved and proceeded to make it into a massive death strip of 2 layers of wall, an outer and an inner layer, anti-tank barriers, guard towers, armed guards who were ordered to shoot to stop people escaping, guard dogs, all sorts of other obstacles. So the Berlin Wall was always 2 walls with a death strip in between. So it was never just one wall. One of the in-depth stories I tell in the book is about Michael Schmidt, who was 20 when he was killed trying to escape from East Berlin to West Berlin in 1984. After unification, his father brought suit against the border guards who shot him, and there were trials. His father then was involved. He was a co-plaintiff in all of the trials of the top former leaders of East Germany. So, in addition to the people who were killed, 40,000 people were able to successfully escape, especially at the beginning, before this was really this intense death strip. Over the 28 years that the wall stood, tens of thousands of people were arrested while planning or trying to escape. And East Germany imposed 71,000 prison sentences. It was a crime to attempt to leave the country without permission. So this was the situation for 28 years, until 30 years ago. The East German regime was under pressure. Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union had instituted reforms. Neighboring Poland was reforming, getting rid of the communist regime. Lots of pressure on the regime in East Germany to change, including to allow freedom of travel. They were working on some sort of modified travel law, but it still wasn't going to give freedom of travel. When this, and I always tell my students, this is, the worst case of being unprepared for a presentation. Günter Schabowski, who was one of the leaders of East Germany, he was the party leader of Berlin, also the press spokesman, showed up in an international press conference the night of November 9th, and mistakenly and erroneously announced that the wall was open. He had come late to the meeting earlier in the day. He took someone's notes. He didn't look very closely at them. Hence, you see his confused face. He's looking down at his notes as people are saying, when he announced, that now the border will be open, people can cross. He was supposed to say, you still have to get a visa to leave, you still have to ask permission, but sort of trust us, we're going to be more liberal, we'll probably let you go visit the West. So when someone says, what does this mean? You know, what does this mean for the Berlin Wall? And he starts, and you can watch it live, you know, there's English subtitles, you know, look it up on YouTube. You see him looking down, and he looks over at his aides, you know, hoping they're going to say something. And so there he is, looking confused and worried. So after this live publicized press conference, hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of Germans headed to the border at the Berlin Wall, where the border guards didn't have any orders. It wasn't supposed to open. So finally, one of them, who couldn't get any clear guidance from his superiors, and he's faced with thousands and thousands of people saying, do you think we're fools? Didn't you see that press conference? Come on, let us out. And he let them out. And so then everyone else did too. And this is the night of November 9th into the morning of November 10th. People dancing on the wall, sitting on the wall at the Brandenburg Gate. Only at the Brandenburg Gate was the wall this thick on top. Everywhere else it was narrow, and it had a rounded top so you couldn't grab it and get over it. So this was the only place it would have been possible to stand and celebrate. And the East German regime never got control of the situation really after that. A lot of other things happened. It took nearly a year and a complicated process until Germany was in fact united less than a year later on October 3rd, 1990. But when the wall fell, it wasn't clear that was what was going to happen. I'm now going to talk to you about 4 steps of how Germany has been dealing with the wall since it fell or was toppled in 1989. So the first phase was get rid of it. One of the slogans of the East Germans on the streets protesting was Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. And so, you know, this was the point. Get rid of it. It's part of our painful history. On top of the Holocaust, this is another thing to sort of feel shame about from German behavior in the 20th century. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to see it. We lived with it for 28 years. Get rid of it. So except for 2 miles out of the 96 miles, it was removed. There are a few places where it's left in Berlin, but the whole point was, you know, get rid of it. That's what people wanted. And to the extent that people were thinking about the past in newly united Germany and something that they should be really coming to terms with, they were much more looking back again, now as a united country, to the Holocaust. And ultimately, in 2005, they would unveil this massive Holocaust memorial in the heart of Berlin, right next to the Brandenburg Gate. But there were some people, and this is the first memory activist I'm going to talk about, who said, this was 28 years of our history. People lost their lives. Families were divided. We can't just forget this history. We have to remember this history. And in fact, we've got to save some of the wall as a memorial. And Manfred Fischer, who was a pastor of a church that had been divided when the wall went up, he's in the suit holding the hammer, putting up a sign, asking people, a few months after the wall opened, he's putting up a sign asking people, please don't come take pieces, don't hammer on it, don't take souvenirs, don't bring bulldozers. You know, we've got to save some part of this difficult history. And as he said when I interviewed him, he said, to me, this was a crime scene. And you do what you do in a crime scene. You mark it off so no one can touch it. That was his instinct. He particularly was motivated because, as you can see here, the church He was the pastor of the Reconciliation Congregation, the church that had been built in 1894, found itself in the death strip of the Berlin Wall after 1961. No one could get to it. You can see in front of the wall is in front of the church. You can see the wall sort of both to the left of the screen and the right of the screen. The East German regime in January of 1985 decided to blow up the church, saying, you know, it's in the middle of where the border guards need to see people who might be trying to escape. We're going to demolish the church. So you can imagine that you know, was a big motivation for him afterwards to remember this history. Ultimately, he also argued, look, with the division of Berlin by the wall, it divided the street where his parish was on, Bernauer Straße. So the building you see was East Berlin. The sidewalk in front of it, from decades-old maps of Berlin, the sidewalk was West Berlin. So you see people jumping out of their windows. You can see East German military guys in the door trying, you know, sort of hoping they can stop this East German citizen from fleeing, but they can't. Others are waiting below, often fire brigades below with these huge nets for people to jump into, and then rushing across the street from their house in East Berlin into West Berlin. So that's why Manfred Fischer said, it's not just that we need a memorial in general, we need something on this street, because this shows the terrible impact the wall had on the lives of people who lived on this street and in so many other places in Berlin. Ultimately, he succeeded in getting massive state support, but it took years and many battles, a story which I tell in the book. On the left, you can see pretty much of what you see on the left is part of the 8-block long official National Berlin Wall Memorial. The oval building in the top on the left is the new chapel he built. Instead of a massive church, he built a chapel for church services, and you see the piece of long stretch of the wall that he fought to preserve right there. But this took a very long time, and initially in the 1990s, people thought he was crazy, and he didn't get very far. And even other people on the street said, no, we completely disagree. We don't want to keep the wall. We saw it for 28 years, and we want to get rid of it. But he pushed and pushed, and ultimately prevailed. But one key thing that helped him when it seemed he wasn't having a lot of success was the next person I want to tell you about, who wasn't German at all. She's on the far right. Her name is Alexandra Hildebrandt. In fact, she's from Ukraine. So not German, although her father was an ethnic German, but she was born and raised in the Soviet Union in Ukraine, but married a man who was the director of a very famous museum in Berlin called the Checkpoint Charlie Museum. I see some heads nodding. Tourists who go to Berlin tend to go to the Checkpoint Charlie Museum. She agreed with Manfred Fischer that more should be done to remember victims of the wall. But she wanted it all to happen where she was, not where he was, right at Checkpoint Charlie. So for the 15th anniversary of the fall of the wall in 2004, she unveiled 1,065 wooden crosses for people she said were victims of the wall or the broader East German, West German border. She was very critical of the German government, saying, you haven't paid any attention to these people. She pointed out the fact that 4 blocks away from here at Checkpoint Charlie was the ground where the Holocaust Memorial was being built. This did not get her a lot of support, but she said, look, those victims are being remembered as they should be, but there are also other German victims that need to be remembered of a different regime, of the communist regime and of the Berlin Wall. And I've interviewed her several times and all sorts of federal and state officials, and her action was really a turning point because it got massive public support, it got massive media support. Many people agreed, yeah, we haven't done enough to commemorate people who died at the wall. She's right. But, they said she's a private citizen. She shouldn't do it. The government should be doing more. So ultimately, back at Bernauer Strasse, at the official Berlin Wall Memorial, they unveiled a few years later this window of commemoration with pictures of each of the people who they have found out thus far. It's 140 people who were killed at the wall. In the center of the screen with the white rose in front of him is Michael Schmidt, who I mentioned before, who I write a lot about in my book. So this was a turning point after the first process of leave it in the past, we don't want to see the wall, we don't want to talk about it. The second part of the process was we've got to remember, we've got to commemorate the victims. Now comes a third process. 10 years ago, a third step, 10 years ago for the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall, with yet another memory activist, this one from the former East Germany, Tom Zello, on the left in his hippie days as a dissident in East Germany. On the right, he's got the jeans on. He's standing in the photograph of the three of them. He's the one on the left. He's cleaned up a bit since the hippie dissident days in East Germany. And he feels that another part of the history of the Berlin Wall needs to be remembered, namely the positive part, the peaceful fall of the wall, and the process that led to that. What he and many others call the peaceful revolution that took place in East Germany in the fall of 1989, with tens of thousands of people on the streets. Most importantly, the photograph on the left, it was in the city of Leipzig on October 9th, so a month before the wall fell, was the largest demonstration to date in East Germany. 70,000 people marched peacefully around the old city square, the Ring Road in Leipzig. Everyone expected that the secret police would crack down. There were rumors of body bags being ready, extra blood plasma in hospitals. Instead, the authorities were so overwhelmed by the sheer number of demonstrators and their peacefulness, and they were carrying candles, that they didn't do anything. And this gave tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other East Germans courage, saying, wow, if they did it, we can do it too. So Tom Zello wanted to tell this story. And this story was embraced by politicians for the 20th anniversary. Opening his exhibit with him in the center of the screen is the Federal Minister of Culture. To his right was the Foreign Minister, Steinmeier, who's now the President of Germany. And on the right is the Mayor of Berlin, Klaus Wowereit. So massive political backing for this exhibit about the peaceful revolution and the peaceful fall of the wall. What I argue is that this was taken up by politicians as a new founding myth for United Germany, a new narrative of United Germany, saying Germany is now in the company of nations it has long wanted to be in, those with democratic revolutions as their founding moments. East Germany was born, United Germany was born from the first ever in German history successful democratic revolution. We should be proud of this. We should understand that not only in our past and among us are there perpetrators from the Nazi period and the communist period. There are also heroes among us, heroes who helped peacefully bring down the Berlin Wall and the East German communist regime. This was on full display on November 9th, 2009, as Angela Merkel in the center. You can see Hillary Clinton all the way to the right in the red scarf. World leaders came to celebrate the 20th anniversary with the Germans. This was a huge thing for Germans, feeling finally there's something in our history that we can be proud of, and that in fact people want to come here and celebrate with us. It was a grand celebration ending with fireworks, which continued 5 years later for the 25th anniversary. Where they had 8,000 balloons that were released into the sky that evening. But now, the final part of my talk looks at developments in Germany since then, since the refugee crisis of 2015, when so many refugees from Syria and elsewhere flooded into Germany. This has really changed the atmosphere in the country. Now, Angela Merkel welcomed them, saying famously, "Wir schaffen das." We can do it. We can take in all these people. She said, we've had massive numbers of refugees before. We can do this. We have a strong economy. We can do this. Many Germans welcomed these refugees, but some did not. And this has given rise to the growth of the far-right party, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, which you can see in the last federal elections in 2017. They came in third, getting 12.6% of the vote, the third largest party represented in the German parliament. Just a few weeks ago, there were elections in 2 states in the former East, in Brandenburg and Saxony, and both of them, the AfD came in second. There will be a third election in another former East German state at the end of October. So there are now serious divisions between East and West and challenges to this glorious, happy, proud narrative of 2009 and 2014. Commemorative events like big anniversaries can unite or divide people. And right now, in this 30th anniversary year, it's definitely bringing out the divisions. The support for the far-right party is far stronger in the former East than it is in the West. There are also ongoing economic problems in the East. It continues to lag behind the West in multiple ways, in monthly earnings, hourly wages, broadband internet access, birth rate, job opportunities, productivity, all sorts of things. Now, the differences have narrowed much over the past 30 years, but somehow right now no one's talking about that. All they're talking about is the ways in which the East is still lagging. And so this is front page news regularly in Germany right now, which has put a serious damper on plans for a big celebration. And there is a big government commission in charge of it, led by Matthias Platzek, who a few days ago said, as of apropos of what they're going to do on the 30th anniversary, we can't just say, be proud and celebrate. We've got to do more. There have to be dialogues. Yet they are planning a big celebration over 7 days in Berlin with history workshops and all sorts of things. But right now, what I want to highlight in concluding are the very different kinds of lessons German politicians have drawn about the history of the wall. In 2009 and 2014, it was much more the triumphant, confident lessons that everyone was talking about, that the wall could not permanently suppress the desire for freedom. Freedom and democracy won out. Good can triumph. Walls can be overcome. Anything is possible. Germans can be heroes in bringing down walls and supporting democracy. Now, instead, it's much more the tough lessons that are being emphasized. The fact that the wall existed shows that freedom and democracy can't be taken for granted and must in fact be fought for every day. And that history didn't end with the fall of the wall. Things have been difficult in the transition for people in the former East. There's still a wall in the mind for many people. And of course, other walls in Europe and elsewhere are going up. And most depressingly for German political leaders, the message Germans aren't always heroes or democrats. They're very worried by the violence against foreigners on the streets these days. And finally, I myself was on a plane headed to Berlin when the wall fell. I took off from New York City on the night of November 9th. This is me 30 years ago, standing in front of the wall. I took off from New York, headed to Berlin. You couldn't fly directly to Berlin. You had to fly via Frankfurt. So I got a commuter flight in Frankfurt. And when I got on the plane, the pilot came on the intercom and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, in case you haven't heard," which I hadn't, "the Berlin Wall fell last night and we are flying into history." And I spent the next 10 incredible days in Berlin getting my own pieces of the wall and witnessing this incredible period. So with that, I'll end, and we both look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Once again, thanks very much for two very enlightening talks, dealing with very different periods. First question to you, Joshua. You mentioned that Stalin's death and the opening by the Soviet leaders, indicated by Eisenhower's speech, which was printed in full in Pravda, that really was a new initiative, a new genuine opening towards the West. So was an opportunity to overcome the Cold War at an early stage, was an opportunity lost?
Well, you and I have both written about this and thought about this a lot. I can't say what would have been achieved if Eisenhower had agreed to meet with, say, Malenkov or Molotov in the spring of 1953, say, meet in Helsinki or Stockholm. No one can say what would have been achieved. But I do believe there was an opportunity for dialogue. The Soviets understood the need to defuse the military fighting in Korea, and that succeeded. That was the worst crisis between the two sides. And through their initiative, the armistice was achieved. Secondly, the division of Germany and the broader division of Europe, that got into deeper questions of Soviet defense capacities and their very deep and legitimate concern about a resurgent Germany. Germany had invaded Russia twice in the 20th century. So Russia and the Soviet Union had legitimate concerns. Could those concerns have been met at the same time reducing Soviet presence in Eastern Europe with certain other kinds of guarantees? Who can say? The Soviets were very leery on their own of certain dialogue, because Khrushchev thought maybe they'll take advantage of us. Stalin's barely cold in the grave, and they want to come talk to us. Well, it wasn't clear that Eisenhower wanted to come talk to them. He was very wary of dialogue. He thought that the Soviets had taken advantage of Roosevelt and Truman at Yalta, and then Potsdam. I think that's a misreading of what happened. That's my view. I wish Eisenhower had been willing to meet with them. Something could have been done. But once the outbreak of riots in East Germany took place and the suppression by Soviet troops, no dialogue could take place.
Thank you. What was Gorbachev's reaction to the fall of the Berlin Wall? Any idea?
Well, as far as we know, he was very happy with it in the sense that he made clear to the Eastern European leaders that there would be no further Soviet intervention. So it was kind of an inevitable consequence of Gorbachev's reforms and his message to East European leaders. After all, Berlin, that was not the first step of reform in Eastern Europe. It was, and not the last step either.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk about the celebrations of the fall of the wall, but I must admit I'm a little bit more cynical. 10 years, okay. 20 years, you celebrate again. 30 years, you celebrate again. Now every 10 years, while the problems in Germany keep piling up. Will that not be reviewed by many people in Germany as simply a celebration of something which, only needs to be celebrated to some extent? Because a lot of people look at the present problems, look at what they view as present problems, and they are not in a mood to celebrate. So is what we then see with that spectacle, as you nicely outlined, that spectacle, will that not lead to further resentment, further antagonism by a certain part of society instead of they being integrated?
Well, that was precisely the point I was making at the end of my talk, absolutely. I mean, and that's the mood right now. And the leadership is fully aware of that, and they've said that.
But they're still celebrating.
Well, there's a very strong feeling. They're doing it in a much more subdued way than they did it before, but the leadership is caught in a really difficult position on this, because on the one hand they feel it is amazing what happened on November 9th, 1989, that it was all peaceful, that after 28 years of Germans being killed at the Berlin Wall, in fact, it came toppling down peacefully. That is an amazing thing, and the majority of Germans are very happy about that. So what actually happened on November 9th, the vast majority of Germans are happy with. So celebrating that is one thing. Talking about everything that happened since then is another. I mean, as one person I interviewed said, well, everyone is really happy with what happened November 9th. November 10th, 11th, October, and after that is another story. And so, it's been interesting to watch the leadership trying to negotiate this, because they clearly feel passionately, as do, certainly many former East Germans who were on the streets. Look, this is an important part in our history, and after everything Germany has happened in German history, this is something that we should highlight and young people should know about. But on the other hand, there are serious problems in Germany now, and people who were happy with bringing down the communist regime, a lot of them feel very resentful right now with what's happened since then. And so they're trying to find a way to both celebrate what happened, but also talk with very open eyes about the challenges that came after the fall of the wall.
Thank you. How do you see that?
Let me just add that German history is so layered with one tragedy or triumph after another, that after November 9th is also the commemoration of Kristallnacht, back in 1938, when Jews and Jewish institutions and communal centers were attacked throughout Germany and Austria, and thousands were rounded up and sent to camps, and others were sent to the borders and dumped into Poland. So it's one thing to commemorate November 9th and the fall of the wall, as if that somehow trumps, pardon the expression, trumps what happened in 1938. So you can't get out from under the rubble of history in Germany.
And let me just follow up on that. That's exactly why I said that my book deals intensively with this interaction between remembering the wall and remembering the Holocaust.
Right.
Because November 9th was, also the day of the attacks on the synagogues and Jewish businesses and Jews in their homes and Jewish cemeteries. And so politicians, when they give their speeches on this date, they're always now talking about both.
Thanks very much indeed. I think we should open it up to questions from you, the audience. This lady with the blue cap. Yes, please.
This is a question.
Can we wait for a microphone? Yeah.
This is a question for either one of you or both. Wasn't Putin in East Germany at the time of the fall of the wall? Can you tell us how he reacted? And a related possible question is, how is he responding now to the 30th anniversary of the fall?
Thank you.
Yes, Putin has written about this. He's been interviewed about this. Yeah, Putin was with the KGB in the East German city of Dresden during all of this. So those photographs I've showed of the massive demonstrations of tens of thousands of East Germans marching on the streets, he was there witnessing all of that. And so he saw communism in East Germany fall down around him. He had angry citizens coming up to his KGB headquarters, and he was pretty nervous and only sort of, told a white lie to get people to go away. So I think that is an important part of understanding why Putin is so, hold on to power, so threatened by people marching on the streets, clearly threatened by elections. He remembers this very much.
The story he tells is that they were busy inside the building destroying documents because they were afraid that people in the streets would get in and take control of the building and take control of the files. And that he says they called Moscow to ask for instructions and no one was answering, meaning it's over, the whole thing is collapsing.
And it was Putin, of course, who said that the downfall of the Soviet Union was one of the worst days in history. And I'm sure he believes that. And
well, at least in the 20th century.
Well, yeah. But I'm sure he still views the downfall of the Soviet Union as a major calamity which changed world history and changed also his own fate.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Yes, please. David.
I remember as a young student here in Carolina in the late 60s and then at SAIS, learning about the controversial Ostpolitik of then Mayor Willy Brandt and Chancellor. Are there any traces to be found in Ostpolitik from the reforms in Moscow in 1953, or other roots in that time of Ostpolitik? Or conversely, did Ostpolitik provide any roots for the future of the fall of the wall in any of those developments that was Ostpolitik in the memory of people?
Willy Brandt was the mayor of West Berlin when the wall was built by the East Germans. He was incredibly angry that President Kennedy didn't do anything and wrote a sort of brutal letter to Kennedy in which he made that very clear. Kennedy was very offended, but Brandt thought, this is great, great ally I have. From the building of the wall and the fact that the U.S. did nothing to stop it, that was, as Brandt wrote in his memoir, that was the moment he started developing his Ostpolitik, meaning reaching across the wall to East Germany and ultimately to Moscow, because knowing he was going to have to get Moscow's approval in order to improve relations with East Germany. That was absolutely essential to him. in terms of the relationship of his reaching out to the East to the ultimate fall of the wall, something that so many people see as successful, like the fall of the wall, everybody wants to claim credit. So in Germany, there have now been 3 decades of debate of which political party in West Germany had played a greater role in bringing down the wall. Was it Helmut Kohl's CDU, or was it Willy Brandt's Social Democratic Party? Of course it was both, but and Kohl in fact continued Brandt's Ostpolitik of reaching out to the East and ultimately giving the Eastern regime loans and helping them in lots of ways, and recognizing East Germany and getting more movement back and forth of East and West Germans across the border, which ultimately allowed the East Germans to see what life was like in the West and want that kind of life and want to bring down the wall. So there's, I think, an intimate connection between Brandt's Ostpolitik and what happened both with the building of the wall before and the fall of the wall after.
Let me just add that the frustration on the part of Mayor Brown with President Kennedy was not unprecedented. Certainly there was some feeling in June of 1953 on the part of people in East Germany and East Berlin that Western military did not intervene, let's say in East Berlin, to protect the demonstrators and kind of deter the actions by Soviet military forces. But people were not willing to risk an outright war over that. And in 1956, now that Eisenhower is president and Foster Dulles is U.S. Head of the State Department, they had encouraged people in Eastern Europe to revolt. And here the Hungarians are in the street revolting. And yet, what could they do? Were they going to send in the troops, send in the Marines into Budapest? Of course not. So Kennedy faced the same kind of dilemma on a different scale in Berlin. And the decision was made, whether we agree with it or not. I'm sure there's endless discussions we can read about over what to do. And the decision was made, well, there's a lot we can do, short of provoking a war.
Yeah, and I would say the documents actually show us that the West knew what was coming. Not precisely, not on which day, but there were pretty clear ideas and rumors around that something like a wall would be built, or at least proper border fortifications. And the United States had no intention to do anything about it, neither had the British or the French. Actually, British Prime Minister Macmillan was on holiday when the wall was built on holiday in Scotland, when he was informed about that. And of course he didn't break off his vacation. He said, well, shame for the Germans, but it will relax the Cold War situation. The situation of war, of imminent war, that something by accident might happen because of that open border, that is gone now. Tough for the Germans, but much better for world peace. And I think that was the attitude of all Western countries, and some in Germany as well even. Konrad Adenauer, the West German Chancellor, who was in Bonn at the time, he did not immediately travel to West Berlin either. It took him a few days to get there. So the attitude was very ambiguous, and what we now celebrate or deplore as the building of the wall was not necessarily as deplored then as it is now for geopolitical reasons. In a way, it's fascinating, gives us lots of research to do and talk about. But let's have another question. Yes, Gerhard.
Comment on a personal experience related to what was just said. I was in Berlin in 1962 and noted that this is shortly after the wall went up. The West Berlin police in the British sector was trying to keep the crowds off, but there were not enough of them. And at a distance further into West Berlin were British soldiers protecting the West Berlin police to make sure that there was no incident. And I could not help thinking of one of these British soldiers stationed in West Berlin, writing home to Mom. Last week we were in NATO maneuvers to keep the Red Army coming through the Fulda Gap, and this week we're protecting the West Berlin police to make sure that the civilians in Berlin don't storm the wall.
Thank you. Yes, please. Can you, over there.
Let me just respond
Sure.
quickly to that. One of the pictures I showed of Peter Fechter, who was killed at the wall in 1962, it was exactly that kind of incident, that West Berliners would storm the wall and say, this is outrageous. There was a person who was just killed here. Why aren't you doing more? And so, yeah, the West Berlin police and then the Western military personnel would, try to keep angry West Berliners from protesting this kind of thing, because they feared, first of all, that if anybody from the West went over, maybe they would be shot by one of these German border guards. But, the biggest fear was always, ultimately we're going to get into some military conflict with the Soviets.
Yes, please.
So just a comment. I suppose in a certain context, you've already had reparations because you had the Solidaritätszuschlag from 1992 or something up until very recently. So which was in the early 90s, it was 7% of gross wages, and I think up until recently was 5% of all wages in West Germany would go back to East Germany. So that's up until I think this year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it's still happening.
Still happening. So 26
So-called
years.
solidarity tax.
Solidarity tax, exactly. And so, in certain kinds, you already had the reparations, and that's created an enormous amount of resentment in the West, and particularly, I would say, in Freistaat Bayern. Right, they're very unhappy about sending money to the East Germans. So that's the first thing that I would say. So I agree with you. And secondly, I've always thought that Helmut Kohl gets off quite easy, because he basically shows up in history as the guys who reunite Germany, and he did it too quickly. He did it at the wrong price, okay? And all of the West Germans were resentful of Helmut Kohl, that they were all delighted that the wall went down, and they had relatives and cousins and everything they could see. But they absolutely 100% thought he was too rash because he wanted his moment in history. And I've never seen anything written about that. If you have any comments, happy to listen.
Yeah, I mean, Helmut Kohl, the big decision that I think you're talking about is that when the first step toward unity came a few months before the final unity, it came on July 1st, 1990, and it was a currency and social union when the West German powerful Deutschmark became money throughout the country. And the saying was at the time, by the East Germans, if the Deutschmark doesn't come to us, we're going to it. So there was massive pressure on him, because even after free elections in East Germany in March of 1990, which made clear they were going to do a fast track toward unification, and East Germany was going to cease to exist, it was going to be fused into the West. Even when that was clear, massive numbers of people kept moving from the East to the West, wanting to get out now, wanting better opportunities now, and not to wait. So, Kohl did that. He literally on multiple occasions said, please stay where you are, because West Germany was overwhelmed with all the East Germans who were coming in. And so this was part of it, to decide, for the most part, there was a 1-to-1 exchange rate of the East German marks that didn't at all deserve to be exchanged at a 1-to-1 rate, but that harmed the economy very much, because suddenly, you got to pay your workers, but they don't know how to do much, and you're running factories that don't produce much, and it's not efficient, but you got to pay all this solid West German money, and so they shut down a lot of these, and a lot of people were put out put out of work. And so yes, there is all of this is being relived and debated right now in Germany. They're going back and very critical of the process of unification.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah. What we could say to defend Helmut Kohl a little bit, in the unusual position of having to defend Helmut Kohl, usually it's the other way around, or I have to attack him. But he did fear, the West did fear, Bush in Washington as well, that Gorbachev was on the way up, that there was a window of opportunity as long as Gorbachev was still in power. And there was clear resistance to him in Moscow. And there was a coup, as we know. And they thought, if he is gone within 2 months and the old Soviet regime is back, that is the end of any prospect for unification or the end of the Cold War. So there was a rush, but not just for personal historical reasons. Yes, please.
For many of us who grew up with family who lived through the Holocaust, fortunately, or whatever, one always heard mumblings from the older people that beware, it will return. And I'm just curious if I'm too pessimistic or too concerned about the rise of the right as quickly as it appears to happen. Do you see a way that this will regress, or how does one have optimism that this is not just going to take off now in Germany?
Joshua.
I'll defer to Hope.
But can I just say, Stalin said that 10 or 15 years later the Germans will be militaristic again. There will be a second Hitler. So was Stalin a little mistaken regarding the time?
I hope he was very mistaken. One response to our friend's question was the famous comment, I think it was André Maurois in France, when he said, "We love Germany so much we want there to be two of them." So of course after the war people were very wary of a resurgent Germany. And the French were not thrilled at rearming Germany so quickly after World War II. But it had to go along with the other Western powers. I don't claim to have that much expertise on your question. I share your wariness. I was in Berlin for the first time for a week or 10 days this past November. And you have to be struck at how deeply events are commemorated in Berlin, both with regard to the Holocaust and to the East German question. And I don't speak German, I don't have any nearly the history Hope has, and obviously Klaus has, but you're struck wherever you walk. The wall is commemorated, there are bricks in the sidewalk and in the streets of where the wall used to weave its way through the city, and as you walk, as someone not from there, I don't know if I'm on the east side of the street or the west side of the street, because the wall isn't just a straight line, it meanders around. So I don't know which side of Berlin I'm on at any given point. And synagogues are protected. There are tremendous commemorations of the Holocaust, both big and small. So one hopes that Germany learned its lesson. Yes, there is the rise of the far right. There's a lot of pushback as well among German youth to it. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if you were there in November, that was the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht.
Right.
So there were massive commemorations of that in Berlin with the chancellor leading them. I mean, to me, I think the growth of anti-Semitism is as big a problem in the U.S. as it is in Germany. It's because of Germany's history that it gets more attention and sort of more worried. But I think it's happening in both places. Desecrating cemeteries. But the majority of Germans are absolutely opposed to this, and there are always bigger demonstrations of sort of democratic, open-minded, tolerant Germans against the small, loud, often violent, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, very right-wing nationalistic groups. It is deeply, deeply become a part of German society to take responsibility for the Holocaust. It is still taught, massively commemorated. So it's covered in the media because of Germany's history, but the vast majority of Germans are not, at all supportive of the small group who are anti-Semitic and xenophobic.
Thank you.
Let me just add one thing. There's a new book out by an American-born but German professor now, Susan Niemark, where she compares and contrasts how the United States commemorates slavery and the impact of slavery through Jim Crow, and comparing that to how Germany deals with its crimes. And it's a very interesting book, very unsettling in some ways. So whatever our concerns are about Germany, and that's always legitimate, we should never be complacent about our own history and how we commemorate it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I always tell my students, that Germany is the model for dealing with the darkest part of its past. And the U.S., I mean, we don't hold a candle. I thought when we opened in the U.S. a couple of years ago, that new memorial about lynching, I thought Germans would have done this years ago. And when you just mentioned the stones on the street that were the wall, I thought you were going to mention the stumbling stones, Stolperstein, to commemorate Jews. All over Berlin and many other German cities, there are these little copper stones in the sidewalk in front of houses where Jews used to live. And it's got their name, it's got the date when the Jewish person was removed and either, deported to a concentration camp or killed. These are all over the place. So there is very active commemoration.
This is a private initiative. It is not sponsored by this government. It's a private initiative.
But both at the public and the private level, there is a massive amount of recognition of what happened and commemoration of the Holocaust.
When I went to school, we somehow never got around to talking about the Second World War or the Holocaust, but that has changed, I understand. In the past years, I would say the last decade, between the 60s, 70s, and what is happening now, I think a lot of progress has been made in really looking at the past and trying to understand it. More questions, please. Yes, another one, Alan.
Sorry, just one quick one. So, is the situation with the AfD more though anti-immigration than about the horrible history that we discussed? Because I think number one, it's more anti-immigration from the countries that we know they're coming from. Number one, and number two, in terms of being concerned about the AfD, I mean, from what I see, is Mrs. Vital is quite presentable, right? This isn't awful guys and doing horrible things on the street. This is extremely presentable and accomplished politicians. And so, and that's possibly why they're having such success. So I would just say, maybe conflating a little bit, and then secondly, I mean, they're very presentable, and it's anti-immigration just like in other countries.
Certainly the focus is anti-immigration, but the media and the German investigative, the equivalent of the FBI, have now found out that the far right have hit lists. They've already killed one German politician. So it's very worrisome. So, I'd be careful saying, how sort of polished they seem. For example, the Wieland, the Gauland, the head of it, notoriously said, apropos of the Holocaust, he said, that period in German history, excuse what I'm about to say, is bird shit compared to the rest of the glorious German history. We should stop focusing just on those 13 years, So there's also a sense in that group, yes, the main thing is anti-Muslim more than anti-Semitic. But they're also sick of what they call a German cult of shame, of too much apologizing for the Holocaust.
And there are parallels with other right-wing movements, I would say, including in the United States, anti-refugees, but also anti-globalization. You know, the forgotten man, as they are called in the United States often. I think that plays a role as well, plus all the other factors. David.
This guy on the right had his hand up for a long time.
Who was that?
That guy.
Whoever is the guy,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out on the weighting of how much of this is caused because of a failed integration of Eastern Germany, how much of it is just German nationalism, how much of it is the economic common union in Europe and the problems it faces, who's going to pay for everything, and then how much of it is immigration. And it sounds like all these things are kind of hitting at once, and they all get all wrapped up in all kinds of feelings and sentiments, you know, with the German people. It gets it all confused.
And always, I mean, I just read a newspaper article that the town in Saxony where they voted the most of any district anywhere for the far right has no non-Germans. And yet they are panicked and they're all like unbelievably xenophobic and they don't even have any non-Germans. So that's what always happens. It's, you know, people who haven't met these other people. It's a lot easier to think, you know, they're terrible and say all these terrible things. We don't want them, you know, if you've never met them. But also if you feel that, you know, economically you're not where you want to be, it's, you know, they become scapegoats.
This reminds me of the saying about Poland, that you can have anti-Semitism without Jews.
David.
Yeah, it's a little bit off subject for Professor Rubenstein, but you raised it about the uprising in 1956. When we visited, there was clearly very much in the minds of civil servants and military how much they resented that the United States did not back the uprising. It was explained to me that Eisenhower was preoccupied with Suez at the time, and that was the reason. Do you buy that?
Well, it's true, he was preoccupied. It was a major crisis, and that may have helped deflect some attention from the Soviet point of view over what was happening in Eastern Europe and Budapest. But still, their hands were tied. Both sides had atomic weapons, hydrogen bombs. We were not going to go to war, outright war, to intervene in Hungary. It just wasn't possible. And he did have a re-election campaign that November. And the events in Budapest played themselves out in September and October. So he was not going to upset the apple cart, to pardon a superficial metaphor, by going to war in Eastern Europe over Hungary. It just wasn't possible.
Many years ago, I actually wrote a little article about that. There wasn't even a discussion in Washington whether or not to do anything about it. It was clear right from the beginning. Military engagement was totally not on the cards. Because Eisenhower realized, you know, I'm not sacrificing the peace of the world or the security of New York for some country in Eastern Europe I know relatively little about. That was the thinking.
But the Suez intervention was not military, it was diplomatic. Why wouldn't there be a diplomatic intervention?
No, they did protest and so on. But, clear. But what the Hungarians wanted, the Hungarian protesters, they were calling for military help. They really thought the U.S. would show up with tanks and troops, which was totally unrealistic.
There's a reason
because of rollback.
No, because of Radio Free Europe. Because of the Hungarian emigres who were on the U.S. CIA-backed Radio Free Europe, who went too far. They went beyond the guidelines coming from Washington. And they did urge people to go to the streets, and they did imply the U.S. would back them. So there are these terrible stories of American journalists showing up in Hungary, and the citizens saying, oh, you know, is the military right behind you? Are they coming? And, you know, this poor journalist who I remember talking to him, and I mean, he felt so terrible, so embarrassed to have to say, no, the U.S. military isn't behind me. But that's why, you know, because of what was said on Radio Free Europe, to this day, the people who participated in that in Hungary will never forget that.
And keep in mind, it was Foster Dulles who pledged, our intention is to roll back communism. Well, what does that imply? Other than military intervention.
At the time, people still believed what politicians were saying. We have learned better, haven't we? More questions, please. You have got the chance to ask a final great question. And students are allowed to ask questions. There's one, yeah?
Yeah, I'm a student actually. Great timing. Modern Europeanist, German historian, budding complete German historian. Do you think it's worth looking into how Merkel's initial position towards the immigration policy was and then the switch? Because I noticed you didn't really bring that up in your presentation. It's like something to look at as to kind of maybe like a insight into some of the reactions that have come since then.
I believe, and everything I've read, and I've read many of her speeches about this, that her response came from a profoundly principled moral place. Also, probably having been an East German and having lived in a communist regime, and being aware of what Germany had done in the Holocaust, she felt profoundly it was a moral obligation, it was the right thing to do, to help these people who were trying to escape from this terrible civil war in Syria, to let them into a country that was doing far better and was in a position to help them. So it came, for me, I will admire her forever because of that. But many other people, A, didn't have the same response, but B, ultimately said, okay, well, that's wonderful to have that moral response, but, logistically, you got to figure this out. 1 million people came into the country over the next year, and it overloaded the system, and, they're still trying to figure out how to handle it all.
Just a quick follow-up question. I was told that many of those people have moved on to other countries. Do you know anything about that?
Some have, some are there. This is the issue. Some get lost in the system. Some are accepted and can stay. Others not. But, there have been some bad incidents, right, including, one of the guys who drove a truck into the Christmas market in central Berlin. He's one of the people who had been denied, the right for asylum, but he was still there. Nobody was tracking him. So the whole system of figuring out who's where and what to do with them, the Germans are still grappling with this.
And when you listen to the discussion, you think every year still 1 million people were coming, which is simply not true.
Yeah.
Much fewer than 100,000 people are coming every year. But the discussion, when you listen to it, particularly from the AfD and other right-wingers, you think there's still millions coming every year, which is total nonsense. So the situation is being exploited rhetorically a lot. I think we probably have come to the end, unless there is someone with a really urgent question among our students, perhaps. Then I would like to give maybe the final word to our two speakers and tell me what you thought or what you think how the development in Germany will develop.
On Germany?
Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping that the new leadership will pick up the mantle of Chancellor Merkel, both internally to Germany, with preserving German democracy and the integrity of German democracy, but also playing a leadership role in Europe with Premier Macron to keep Europe united and kind of balance out whatever Mr. Trump's initiatives will be.
So should Germany play a globally more involved?
Yes, I think Germany should. Yes. But especially within Europe, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I share those sentiments. I think everybody's worried what will happen post-Merkel. She's been there for so long. She's been in power since 2005. It's hard to imagine. And so because Germany has been such a beacon of stability and democracy in Europe, you know, it's worrisome. There's no way her successor can have the kind of influence at home or abroad very quickly that she has had. So it's going to be a transition period, and we'll see.
Thank you very much. Bo Paris and Joshua Rubenstein.